Hello and welcome to Mythos and Logos. The Roman writer Tacitus recorded a speech that may or may not have been real, spoken by a Caledonian war chief named Calgacus in 83 AD. According to Tacitus, this painted warrior stood before 30,000 fellow tribesmen at a place called Mons Graupius, somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, and declared that Romans create a desolation and call it peace. Whether Calgacus actually said these words or Tacitus invented them doesn't matter as much as what came next. The Roman legions, disciplined and armoured, crashed into a force of warriors whose bodies were covered in swirling blue designs, whose battle cries echoed off mountain stone, whose very appearance was so alien to Mediterranean eyes that Romans could only call them Picti, the painted ones. The legions won that day, as legions usually did. But here's what's strange. Rome conquered Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, vast swathes of Germania. They built walls, roads, cities, baths. They left Latin words embedded in every European language, Roman law in every legal system, Roman architecture copied for 2,000 years. But north of what would become Hadrian's Wall, in the lands of the painted people, Rome left almost nothing. The Picts remained unconquered, unromanized, unbowed. They maintained their independence for over 600 years, resisted every invader, developed one of the most mysterious symbol systems in European history, and then vanished so completely that we don't even know what language they spoke. Tonight, we will journey into the Highland mists to search for these painted people. We'll decode their mysterious symbol stones that still stand across Scotland, each carved with crescents and beasts and mirrors, whose meanings scholars still debate. We'll stand in their great fortresses at Burghead and Dunatar, where they ruled kingdoms that controlled the northern seas. We'll discover how they saved Scotland from Anglo-Saxon conquest at the Battle of Dun-Nechstein, changed history by converting to Christianity through mysterious royal women, and ultimately transformed themselves so completely that they became the foundation of Scotland itself. This is a story of warriors who terrified Roman legions, of artists who carved messages in stone we still cannot fully read, of a people who chose transformation over conquest, mystery over clarity, and whose ghosts still walk every Scottish glen. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. As the present fades to whispers, we find ourselves transported to the year 83 AD, to the slopes of an unknown mountain in Caledonia, where the summer sun glints off Roman armour and painted skin, where the fate of the northernmost reaches of Britain hangs in the morning mist, when Rome met the painted people. Picture 10,000 Roman soldiers standing in perfect formation, their rectangular shields locked together like scales on some enormous serpent. The morning sun catches on polished iron, on the eagle standards that have been carried from the Tiber to the Thames, and now to this strange northern place, where the very air tastes different, thick with peat smoke and highland rain. These men have marched for weeks through territory that defies every Roman understanding of civilization. No roads grid this landscape. No towns announce themselves with forums and bathhouses. Instead, there are only endless hills that roll like frozen waves, covered in purple heather that whispers in the wind, and the occasional glimpse of something that makes even veteran soldiers touch their protective amulets. The hill forts. They perch on every significant peak, like eagles' nests built by giants, circular walls of fitted stone, some of them already ancient when Rome was just a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. The Romans have tried to scout them, but their inhabitants melt away into the landscape like morning mist, leaving only cold hearths and the unsettling sense of being watched. And they are being watched. Every Roman in this army knows it. Eyes follow them from ridgelines, from forest edges, from places where the land itself seems to provide concealment. Sometimes they catch glimpses of the watchers, and what they see makes them question everything they thought they knew about barbarians. These are not the Gauls, with their wild hair and gold talks, not the Germans with their bear skins and long spears. These northern people are something else entirely. Their bodies are living tapestries, covered in designs that seem to move in the shifting light, spirals that follow the curves of muscle, beast shapes that ripple when they breathe, geometric patterns so complex that Roman minds, trained on the straight lines of architecture and engineering, struggle to follow them. The patterns are dark blue, almost black in certain lights, made from the woad plant that grows wild in these hills. But it's not just decoration. The Romans have captured a few stragglers, examined the markings up close. The designs follow rules, exhibit meanings, tell stories that no Mediterranean mind can read. Agricola, the Roman general, has tried to gather intelligence about these people. His interpreters, men who speak the Celtic tongues of the Britons to the south, can barely communicate with them. Their language contains sounds that don't exist in Latin or Greek or any tongue the Romans know. When they speak among themselves, it's like listening to the landscape itself given voice, all soft consonants and rolling vowels that blend with the sound of wind through heather. They call themselves something that sounds like Pect or Peth to Roman ears, but what it means, no one can say. The Romans, always practical, simply call them Picti, the painted ones, as if the decoration were their only notable feature. How wrong they would prove to be. You stand at the edge of empire. You are Marcus, a Roman auxiliary from Gaul, standing in the third rank of the 9th legion as the morning mist begins to lift. Your mail shirt weighs heavy on your shoulders, already hot despite the cool northern air. You can smell the man in front of you, unwashed wool and fear sweat, the vinegar they all drank this morning to steady their nerves. Your hand grips your pilum, the weighted javelin that has won Rome 100 battles, but your palm is slick. You fought Germans on the Rhine, fought rebellious Britons in the south, but this feels different. The mist peels back like a curtain, and your breath catches. They stand on the opposite slope, in no formation Rome would recognize. Yet there's something deliberate about their positioning, like stones placed by ancient hands for purposes beyond war. 30,000 of them, your officers said, though in this moment they seem numberless as highland stones. The front ranks are naked to the waist, their torsos painted in patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. Spirals within spirals, lines that seem to lead nowhere and everywhere. Images of beasts you've never seen, swimming elephants with long tusks, serpents that devour themselves, mirrors that reflect nothing. Some warriors have painted their faces too, half blue and half white, or with elaborate designs around their eyes that make them look barely human. You hear their war horns begin, not the bright brass of Roman trumpets, but something older, deeper. Carnixes, the Gallic scouts call them, though these sound different from the ones you heard in Gaul. These are throatier, almost animal, like the earth itself groaning. The sound rolls across the valley, and you feel it in your chest, in your bones. Then comes their battle cry, and every Roman instinct tells you to run. It's not words, not as you understand them, but a ululation that rises and falls like wind over mountain peaks. Some of the painted warriors begin to strike their shields with their swords, a rhythm that builds and builds until it sounds like thunder approaching. Your centurion barks orders, familiar Latin cutting through the alien sounds, and you feel your training take over. But as the two forces begin to move toward each other, as your sandaled feet slip slightly on the Scottish grass, so different from Mediterranean dirt, you realize that you stand at the absolute edge of everything Rome understands. Beyond these painted warriors lies terra incognita, lands that Rome will never map, never build roads through, never truly comprehend. Win or lose today, some part of you knows that these painted people will outlast your empire. There's something in their eyes, visible even at this distance, that speaks of a connection to this land that no force of arms can break. Before the name, ancient Caledonia, long before Rome gave them a name, before anyone painted their first spiral on willing skin, the ancestors of the Picts were already ancient in this land. The hill forts that dotted every strategic peak, those circular stone fortresses that so unsettled Roman scouts, some of them had already stood for 1,000 years when the legions arrived. Archaeologists, digging through the layers, find evidence of continuous occupation stretching back into the mists of prehistory. At Tapo Noth, in Aberdeenshire, the ruins of a hill fort enclose an area so vast it could have housed thousands. Its vitrified walls, stones fused into glass by some ancient burning, speaking of technologies and conflicts lost to memory. These early Caledonians, for that's what the Romans called the broader population of northern Scotland, were not primitive. They built the brocks, those mysterious circular towers unique to Scotland, rising like stone fingers 50 feet into the sky. Over 500 of them once stood, each one a marvel of engineering with their hollow double walls, their careful corbelling, their galleries and stairs all built without mortar. The finest example still standing partially intact at Moosa in Shetland shows sophistication that challenges every assumption about barbarian architecture. These structures required mathematics, required planning, required a society organised enough to feed specialised builders for months or years. The people who would become the Picts inherited more than stones. In the earth beneath later Pictish settlements, archaeologists find the tools and ornaments of the Bronze Age, the even older worked flints of the Neolithic. At Skara Brae, in Orkney, a village older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, shows houses with stone furniture, drainage systems, and evidence of a comfortable, sophisticated life lived 3,000 years before Rome existed. The Picts didn't spring from nothing. They were the inheritors of traditions so old that they were probably already half mythological to them, stories of ancestors who raised the great stones, who knew the secret names of every stream and hill. By the time Rome encountered them, these people had developed into distinct tribal groups. Tacitus names some of them: the Caledonii themselves, the Vacamagi, the Taexali, the Venicones. Each controlled different regions, from the fertile lands of the east coast to the harsh beauty of the western highlands and islands. They were connected by more than just resistance to Rome. They shared artistic traditions, those swirling patterns that would later become the famous Pictish symbols already appearing on metalwork centuries before. They shared building techniques, religious practices centered on sacred springs and significant stones, and most importantly, they shared a worldview that saw the landscape not as territory to be conquered, but as a living entity to be negotiated with, honoured and protected. The etymology of fear. What's in a name? For the Picts, everything and nothing. The Latin word Picti first appears in Roman texts in 297 AD in a panegyric praising the Emperor Constantius. Picti, the painted ones, or perhaps the tattooed ones, for the Latin could mean either, but this was not their name for themselves. The Irish called them Cruithne, the Welsh Prydain, both words possibly meaning people of the designs or perhaps people of forms. When St. Columba's biographer Adomnan wrote about them, he had to use interpreters, suggesting their language was as foreign to Gaelic speakers as it was to Romans. The name holds fear within it. Roman fear of the incomprehensible. Romans understood conquest, understood submission, understood the integration of defeated peoples into the imperial system. But the Picts refused all three. They painted or tattooed their bodies with designs that seemed to shift meaning with every viewing, patterns that Roman writers describe with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Were they tattoos, permanent marks made with needle and ink? Or were they painted fresh for each battle, each ceremony, each significant moment? The Romans couldn't even agree on this basic fact. Some scholars believe the designs were hereditary. that each family line had specific patterns passed down through generations like heraldic arms. Others think they were earned, marks of achievement or status that accumulated over a lifetime. The Irish sources speak of the Picts as having colourful clothing as well, not the rough wool the Romans expected of barbarians, but carefully dyed garments in blues and greens and reds. Perhaps the body art was meant to be seen against these colours, creating a visual language of rank and role that outsiders could never decode. The patterns certainly meant something crucial, for they appear again and again in Pictish art, carved into stones that would outlast the people who made them. North of Hadrian's Wall, Marcus the deserter slipped away from his garrison on Hadrian's Wall in the dead of winter, 128 AD. He'd stood too many watches, staring north into lands Rome had abandoned, lands that existed beyond the reach of Roman law, Roman roads, Roman civilization. The punishment for desertion was death. But after 10 years of garrison duty, death seemed less frightening than another decade of watching that northern horizon. He took only what he could carry: his sword, a cloak, enough hard biscuit to last a week. He thought he'd die in the wilderness. Instead, he found them. Or perhaps they found him. The patrol materialized from a copse of birch trees like they'd been formed from bark and shadow. 5 Pictish warriors, their exposed skin covered in those mesmerizing blue patterns despite the cold. Marcus dropped his sword, raised his empty hands, and spoke the only word of their language he'd learned from captured prisoners: sanctuary. They looked at him for a long moment, these painted warriors who'd haunted Roman nightmares for generations. And then one laughed, not cruel laughter, but genuine surprise. They took him, not as prisoner, but as curiosity, to a settlement 3 days north of the wall. What Marcus found there shattered every assumption he'd held about barbarian life. The settlement wasn't a collection of primitive huts, but a planned community centered around a broch, one of those impossible towers that seemed to defy Roman engineering logic. Houses of stone with thatched roofs arranged in careful patterns, drainage ditches that carried waste away from living spaces, workshops where smiths created metalwork as fine as anything in Roman markets. The people wore wool dyed in colours Marcus hadn't known could come from natural sources: deep blues from woad, brilliant reds from madder, yellows from weld. They had glass beads, not Roman imports but their own creation, and their pottery, while different from Roman styles, showed technical skill and artistic sophistication. He lived among them for 3 years before disease took him, and in that time he learned truths that would have amazed his fellow Romans. The Picts had laws, complex ones, passed down through memorization by special rememberers who could recite precedents going back centuries. They had medicine, using herbs and treatments unknown to Roman physicians. Their children learned mathematics through stone games, astronomy through memorized star patterns, history through songs that took entire nights to perform. They weren't barbarians refusing civilization. They had chosen their own path to it, one that valued different things than Rome. Marcus died speaking their language, wearing their patterns painted on his aging skin, understanding finally that the wall hadn't been built to keep the barbarians out, but to mark the limits of Roman imagination, the language that vanished. Of all the mysteries the Picts left behind, none frustrates scholars more than their language. We have it, carved in stone using the Ogham alphabet borrowed from the Irish, scratched onto small stones and monumental crosses alike. About 3 dozen inscriptions survive, just enough to torment linguists with possibilities, but never enough to crack the code. The inscriptions from the Shetland Islands, from eastern Scotland, from scattered sites across the Pictish kingdoms, they sit there like locked doors, to which we've lost the keys forever. What makes it more maddening is that we can read the letters. Ogham is no mystery. It's an alphabet developed in Ireland using combinations of lines and notches that could be easily carved along the edge of a stone. Irish Ogham inscriptions are perfectly readable, But when the Picts adopted this writing system, they used it to write a language that seems connected to no other tongue we know. The inscriptions contain letter combinations that make no sense in any Celtic language, in Latin, in any Germanic tongue. Some scholars detect hints of something pre-Indo-European, a language that might have been spoken in these islands before the Celts, before any of the peoples we know from history arrived. Consider the inscription from Lunasting in Shetland, Eto Qhets, Ahertan, HCCV Vevnatons. Try to pronounce it, the double and triple consonants, the mysterious patterns that repeat across different stones but never quite the same way. Some scholars think it's not a language at all but a cipher, a code system used for sacred or royal purposes. Others believe it represents a language so different from anything in the Indo-European family that we simply lack the framework to understand it. The few Pictish words that survived into Scottish Gaelic, mainly place names beginning with pit, meaning a piece of land, suggest a language that thought about space and territory in ways different from its neighbours. The Romans who tried to negotiate with Pictish kings needed interpreters, even when they had interpreters for British Celtic languages. St. Columba, arriving from Ireland to convert the Pictish king Bride, brought his own translator. The Pictish language wasn't just different, it was alien to ears trained on Celtic and Latin sounds. And then, sometime between 900 and 1100 AD, it vanished completely. No gradual fade, no centuries of bilingual inscriptions helping us bridge the gap. Just silence. The last speakers taking with them the ability to read those stone inscriptions, to understand the true names of Scottish rivers and mountains, to decode the real meaning behind those mesmerizing painted patterns that gave the Picts their Roman name. Moonlight on standing stones. Night falls across the Pictish landscape differently than it does in southern lands. Here, in summer, darkness barely comes at all, just a long twilight that paints the world in shades of deep blue and silver. The standing stones, those monuments already ancient when the Picts carved their symbols upon them, seem to gather moonlight like cupped hands holding water. At Callanish on Lewis, the stones stand in their circle, and avenues, casting shadows that move like clock hands, marking time on scales human minds struggle to comprehend. The Picts inherited these sacred landscapes, these arrangements of stone that map astronomical events, that mark the turning of seasons and the movements of heavenly bodies. They added their own layer of meaning, carving their crescents and V-rods and swimming beasts onto stones their ancestors had raised for purposes now forgotten. In the half-light of Scottish summer nights, you can still see them if you know where to look. The symbols seem to shift in the changing light, the carved lines catching shadows differently as the moon travels overhead. Listen to the night sounds around these ancient stones. The wind speaks differently here, channeled by monument placement into whispers and moans. Sheep call to each other, in voices that haven't changed since Pictish herders watched their flocks. Owls hunt with the same silent wings that Pictish priests might have seen as messages from other worlds. Water runs in burns and streams, following courses that Pictish settlements relied upon, carrying the same eternal music of motion over stone. In winter, the aurora borealis dances green and gold across the northern sky, and you understand why the Picts painted spirals and waves and patterns that seem to move. They were painting the sky brought down to earth, the movement of divine lights captured in woad skin. The symbol stones speak. Imagine walking through a Scottish field and encountering a standing stone 7 feet tall, carved 1200 years ago, with symbols that seem to vibrate with meaning you cannot quite grasp. This is the experience of meeting a Pictish symbol stone, and Scotland has over 300 of them, each one a message from a vanished people, written in a symbolic language that no living person can fully read. The symbols repeat across hundreds of miles and centuries of time, with a consistency that speaks of deep meaning, careful tradition, and shared understanding among the Picts themselves. Yet to us, they remain beautiful mysteries, windows into minds that thought in patterns we've forgotten how to recognize. The most common symbols appear so frequently that scholars have given them names based on what they resemble to modern eyes. The crescent and V-rod, looking like a decorated moon with an arrow or broken spear laid across it, appears on nearly 100 stones. The double disc and Z-rod, two circles connected by a bar with another bent line intersecting them, shows up almost as often. Then there are the mirrors and combs, always paired together, always carefully detailed. Swimming beasts that might be dolphins, or might be creatures of pure imagination. Serpents and dragons intertwining in patterns that Celtic art would later make famous. Bulls and boars and eagles, rendered with such careful attention to detail that you can identify the species, yet stylized in ways that make them seem more than mere animals. What do they mean? The most compelling theory suggests their names, perhaps personal names or clan identifiers, written in a symbolic system like Japanese mon or European heraldic arms. The way symbols combine on stones, usually in pairs or specific groupings, supports this idea. A stone might bear a crescent and V-rod above a beast, possibly meaning something like whoever of the crescent clan, son of someone of the beast clan. The mirror and comb combinations often appear on stones that seem to commemorate women, leading some scholars to see them as feminine symbols, though whether they indicate the person commemorated or the person commissioning the stone remains unknown. But there's something deeper here than mere names. The stones cluster around significant sites, ancient burial grounds, sacred springs, boundary markers between territories, places where important events occurred. The earliest ones from the 5th and 6th centuries AD are simple, just the symbols themselves carved with confident precision. Later stones from the 7th and 8th centuries become elaborate artworks, incorporating Christian crosses and biblical scenes alongside the ancient Pictish symbols, suggesting a people who saw no contradiction between their ancestral traditions and their new faith. The Hilton of Cadboll stone, before Victorian restoration destroyed much of its Pictish character, showed a hunting scene of incredible complexity surrounding the traditional symbols, with horses and riders and dogs all swirling around a central panel where a woman rides side saddle, possibly a Pictish noblewoman whose name those symbols would have proclaimed to any Pict who passed. The technical skill required to carve these stones speaks of specialized craftsmen, possibly traveling workshops that moved between kingdoms, creating monuments on commission. The tools were simple, iron chisels and hammers, but the artistry transcends the technology. Some stones show evidence of having been painted, traces of pigment in the carved grooves suggesting these monuments once blazed with colour. Picture a landscape dotted with these painted standing stones, each one visible from miles away, each one proclaiming messages about territory, lineage, achievement, or memorial that every Pict could read, but which are now locked away forever. At Dunfermline in Perthshire stands one of the most magnificent examples, a cross slab that merges Christian and Pictish traditions seamlessly. Angels surround a Celtic cross on one side, while the reverse bears a whole catalogue of Pictish symbols arranged with mathematical precision. The carving is so fine you can see the individual feathers on the angel's wings, the detailed musculature of the Pictish beast, the delicate spirals within spirals that decorate every border. This wasn't primitive art. This was mastery of stone that equals anything produced in continental Europe during the same period. The Picts weren't just leaving messages. They were creating monuments of such beauty that 12 centuries of Highland weather haven't diminished their power to inspire awe. You are a Pictish stone carver. Your hands are steady, despite 40 years of gripping bronze and iron tools. Though your knuckles ache in the morning damp, you stand before a rough slab of sandstone, 7 feet tall, selected from the quarry for its fine grain and lack of flaws. The patron, a noblewoman whose husband died defending the kingdom against Northumbrian raiders, has commissioned this stone for his memory. She has told you the symbols, the eagle for his clan, the crescent and V-rod for hers, the beast swimming between them to show their union. You understand the weight of this work. Long after her grief fades, after her grandchildren's grandchildren have forgotten his name, these symbols will still speak to those who know how to read them. You begin with prayer, not to the Christ the monks speak of, though you honour him too, but to older powers that live in stone itself. Your master taught you that every rock contains its final form waiting to be released, that your role is merely to remove what obscures the truth within. You run your hands across the surface, feeling for the grain, the subtle differences in texture that will guide your chisel. The first marks are the most crucial. Once begun, there's no starting over. This stone will stand or fail based on decisions you make in these beginning moments. The sun tracks across the sky as you work, and you lose yourself in the rhythm of it. Tap, tap, tap. The bronze hammer striking the iron chisel, each blow calculated to remove just enough stone, never too much. The eagle emerges first, its wings spread in eternal flight, each feather a separate miracle of patience and precision. You learn this pattern as a boy, tracing it in dirt, then clay, then softwood, before your master ever let you touch stone. The proportions are sacred, passed down through generations of carvers. The eagle's eye must be exactly here, its talons exactly there, or it won't be a true eagle, just a bird. Days pass in this meditation of creation. Your apprentice brings food you barely taste, water you drink without stopping work. The crescent appears next, its horns reaching toward heaven, decorated with spirals that seem to move as shadows change throughout the day. The V-rod crosses it at the angle tradition demands, its terminals decorated with patterns your master's master invented, patterns that identify your workshop as surely as any signature. The swimming beast comes last, that mysterious creature that might be dolphin or dragon or something that exists only in the realm of symbols. Its body curves in a way that required years to learn, a double spiral that looks simple but contains mathematical relationships you feel rather than calculate. 7 kingdoms in the Highland mist. The Picts were never one people under one crown, but rather a confederation of kingdoms that waxed and waned in power, allied and fought, merged and split apart across 6 centuries of recorded history. 7 kingdoms traditionally, though the number fluctuated as smaller territories were absorbed or broke away. Picture Scotland divided not by the modern boundaries we know, but by ancient tribal territories that followed river valleys and mountain ranges, each kingdom controlling lands that made geographic and cultural sense to people who thought in terms of watersheds and winter grazing, rather than arbitrary lines on maps. Fort'Clyde was the powerhouse, centred in Moray, around the great fortress of Craigfadrig, near modern Inverness. When Roman writers speak of powerful Pictish kings, they usually mean the kings of Fort'Clyde. This kingdom controlled the Great Glen, that geological fault line that cuts Scotland in half, giving them power over communication and trade between east and west. The kings of Fort'Clyde claimed descent from ancient heroes, maintained the largest war bands, and built their power on controlling the fertile lands around the Moray Firth, where grain grew abundant enough to feed armies. Fib, which we call Fife today, held the religious centre at Street Andrews, though they called it Kilrimont then. The kingdom stretched from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Tay, controlling some of the best farmland in Scotland. Sea covered modern Aberdeenshire and Banffshire, a kingdom that looked eastward to the North Sea, growing wealthy on trade with Scandinavia and the Low Countries. Sursin or Angus and the Mearns, Fotla in the area of Atholl and Gowrie, Cat in Caithness and Sutherland, and Fidak in Ross and Cromarty, each maintained distinct identities, their own lines of kings, their own variations on Pictish symbols and art styles. These weren't primitive tribal territories, but organised kingdoms with complex administrative systems. Each had its royal centres, usually built around ancient hill forts, upgraded with timber halls and stone churches as Christianity took hold. They maintained armies, not just seasonal war bands, but trained warriors who served their kings year-round. They had laws and lawgivers, systems of taxation that supported royal households and public works. The king lists that Irish monks preserved show sophisticated succession systems, possibly matrilineal, where kings might inherit through their mothers' lines rather than their fathers, a system so foreign to later medieval minds that historians still debate whether they're reading the evidence correctly. The kingdoms cooperated when faced with external threats, as when they united against Roman invasions or later against Northumbrian expansion, but they also fought among themselves, raids and counter-raids that kept warriors sharp and established pecking orders that could shift with a single successful battle. The archaeological record shows distinctions between kingdoms in their metalwork styles, their pottery traditions, even their burial practices, suggesting that while they shared the broader Pictish culture, each kingdom maintained its own specific identity. These weren't 7 parts of one nation, but 7 nations that shared a cultural framework while pursuing their own destinies. The warrior queens, the Irish annals record something extraordinary about the Picts, something so unusual that medieval chroniclers struggle to explain it. Pictish kings inherited their thrones through their mothers, not their fathers. The Venerable Bede, writing in 8th century Northumbria, claimed the Picts chose their kings from the female royal line whenever the succession was in doubt. If true, this matrilineal system was unique in early medieval Europe, suggesting that Pictish women held power in ways their sisters in neighbouring kingdoms could only dream of. Consider the story of Derylae, recorded in the Pictish king lists as ruling in the late 7th century. The name itself is unusual, possibly feminine, though medieval scribes might have altered it to fit their expectations. But more interesting is what archaeology tells us about high-status female burials from this period. At sites across Pictland, women were buried with symbols of authority, usually reserved for men in other cultures: elaborate chainmail, decorated swords, silver chains of office that seem identical to those found in male royal burials. Either Pictish women could achieve military rank, or these grave goods held different meanings in Pictish society than they did elsewhere. The most intriguing evidence comes from the symbol stones themselves. Numerous stones bear mirror and comb symbols, consistently paired, consistently prominent. Traditional archaeology dismissed these as feminine vanity symbols, but recent analysis suggests something more complex. The mirrors on these stones aren't simple discs but elaborate objects, decorated with spirals and interlacing patterns that speak of high status and careful craftsmanship. They appear on stones, commemorating battles, on boundary markers, on monuments clearly meant to project power. If these symbols represent women, then women were being commemorated for military victories, for controlling territory, for achievements that, in other contemporary cultures, would have been exclusively male domains. The legendary Queen Fenella, recorded in Scottish chronicles as ruling in the late 10th century, supposedly murdered King Kenneth II in revenge for his killing her son. While the story comes from sources written centuries later and filtered through medieval expectations, it preserves a memory of a woman with the power to command warriors, to plan and execute political assassination, to act as a player rather than a pawn in the violent game of royal succession. Whether Fenella herself existed matters less than what her story tells us. That Pictish cultural memory included women who wielded real power, who led rather than merely influenced, who could be remembered as warriors and rulers in their own right. The Battle of Dun Nechstein. The year was 685 AD, and Northumbrian ambitions had swollen beyond all reasonable bounds. King Ecgfrith, ruling from Bamborough over an Anglo-Saxon kingdom that already stretched from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, decided that all of northern Britain should bow to his crown. He had defeated the Mercians, conquered British kingdoms, and extracted tribute from Pictish territories south of the Mouth. Now he wanted it all, against the advice of his counsellors, including the future St. Cuthbert, who prophesied disaster. Ecgfrith led his army north into the heart of Pictland. King Bridie mac Billy of Fortrew knew they were coming. Pictish scouts had tracked the Northumbrian army from the moment it crossed into disputed territory. Bridie, whose very name would become legendary in Pictish history, had spent years preparing for this moment. He pulled his forces back, allowing Ecgfrith to advance deeper and deeper into hostile territory, stretching Northumbrian supply lines through landscape that grew progressively more difficult. The Picts burned their own crops ahead of the advancing army, poisoned wells, left nothing that could sustain an invader. By the time Ecgfrith's forces reached the place, the Irish annalists called Dún Nechtine, somewhere near modern Dunitchen in Angus, they were exhausted, hungry, and far from home. Bridie had chosen his ground carefully. The site, whether the traditionally identified Dunitchen or another location, featured a narrow valley with a marsh or lake on one side and steep hills on the other. The Northumbrians, supremely confident in their military superiority, advanced into this natural trap on May 20th, 685. Bridie's warriors waited in concealed positions on the heights, behind the marsh, in every fold of ground that could hide armed men. When the Northumbrians were fully committed to the valley, the trap snapped shut. Picture the horror of those Anglo-Saxon warriors as Pictish fighters materialized from seemingly empty landscape. They came from above, painted warriors screaming battle cries in their incomprehensible language, their circular shields and long spears perfectly suited to Highland combat. They came from the flanks, forcing the Northumbrians to compress together, negating their advantage in armour and discipline. The marsh prevented retreat in one direction, the hills in another. What followed wasn't a battle, but a slaughter. Ecgfrith himself died with his household warriors around him, fighting to the last, as Pictish spears found every gap in Northumbrian mail. The victory at Dún Nechtine saved Scotland from Anglo-Saxon conquest. Had Ecgfrith won? Had he succeeded in conquering the Pictish kingdoms, Scotland as we know it would never have existed. The north of Britain would have become part of an expanded Northumbria, speaking Old English rather than Gaelic, following Anglo-Saxon law rather than Celtic tradition. Instead, Bridie's victory broke Northumbrian power permanently. They never again seriously threatened Pictish independence. The battle entered legend, commemorated in stone at Aberlemno, where carved Picts forever chase carved Northumbrians from the field, a monument to the day when Highland cunning defeated lowland ambition. Sacred waters, sacred stones. Water speaks differently in Pictish lands. It bubbles up from springs that never freeze even in deepest winter, runs in burns that carve ancient courses through stone, pools in locks that hold their secrets beneath surfaces, dark as polished obsidian. The Picts understood that water was sacred, not in some abstract theological sense, but as a living force that connected this world to others. At Burghead, their great fortress on the Moray coast, archaeologists discovered a well cut deep into solid rock, its chambers arranged to amplify and echo the sound of water, creating an acoustic effect that must have seemed otherworldly to those who descended its steps. These sacred springs and wells appear across Pictland, many still venerated today, though their original names and purposes are forgotten. At Street, Vigians near Arbroath, a spring flows beside carved Pictish stones, the water emerging from the same geological strata the ancient carvers chose for their monuments. The connection wasn't coincidental. The Picts placed their symbol stones at these liminal places, where water met land, where the underworld touched the surface, where the sacred geography of the landscape announced itself through natural phenomena. With the coming of Christianity, these pagan sacred sites weren't abandoned but transformed. Holy wells became associated with saints. usually Celtic missionaries, who understood the importance of continuity in sacred landscape. The well at Burghead, probably dedicated to a Pictish deity, whose name we'll never know, became Street Ethan's Well. The spring at Magel, surrounded by one of the finest collections of Pictish carved stones in Scotland, became Street Martin's Well. But the older associations never quite disappeared. Local traditions preserved memories of healing properties, of ritual practices that had nothing to do with Christian theology, of offerings made to powers that predated any saint. The Picts often carved their stones near these water sources, creating monument complexes that integrated natural and crafted sacred elements. The stones at Aberlemno stand on a ridge above the Bogado burn. The magnificent collection at Street Vigians clusters around that ancient spring. These weren't random placement choices, but careful integration of human art with divine landscape, an understanding that sacred space emerged from the conversation between human intention and natural power. The sound of water running past carved stones, the play of light reflected from stream surfaces onto symbol-covered monuments, the mist rising from heated springs to wreath-standing stones in vapour. All of these created multisensory, sacred experiences that pure stone or pure water alone couldn't achieve. The Silver Hoard. The plough blade struck metal in a field near Norries Law in Fife, 1819 AD, and the farmer thought he'd found buried treasure from some ancient battle. He had, but not in the way he imagined. What emerged from that field over the following days was the largest hoard of Pictish silver ever discovered, though tragedy followed triumph when most of it was melted down for its metal value before anyone recognised its historical importance. Still, what survived tells us more about Pictish wealth and artistry than any royal chronicle could. Imagine the moment when this hoard was buried, probably in the late 7th century when Northumbrian armies threatened Fife. Someone, likely a royal official or wealthy noble, gathered the portable wealth of a lifetime and committed it to the earth for safekeeping. Silver chains of office so delicate they seem impossible to forge with ancient tools. Each link perfectly formed, some with inscribed symbols that match those on the standing stones. Brooches that would have held the cloaks of kings, decorated with interlacing patterns so complex that following a single line with your eye becomes a meditation. Rings and pins, and mysterious objects whose purposes we can only guess at, all crafted with skill that matches anything produced in the workshops of Constantinople or Rome. But it's not just the craftsmanship that amazes, it's what the hoard tells us about Pictish society. The sheer quantity of silver speaks of extensive trade networks, for Scotland has no natural silver deposits. This metal came from elsewhere, probably from melted Roman coins or Byzantine trade goods, transformed by Pictish smiths into objects that express their own cultural values. Some pieces show Irish influence, others Northumbrian, suggesting a culture that absorbed external ideas while maintaining its distinct identity. The inscribed symbols on several pieces match exactly those carved on stones hundreds of miles apart, proving that the symbol system was consistent across Pictish territories and important enough to mark objects of highest value. The placement of the hoard matters too. Norries Law wasn't random hiding place, but a significant location near an ancient cemetery and within sight of several Pictish symbol stones. Perhaps the person who buried it believed the ancestors would guard it, or that the sacred nature of the place would ensure its safety. They never returned to reclaim their treasure, suggesting they died in whatever crisis prompted the burial, taking with them the knowledge of exactly what each piece meant, who wore them, what ceremonies they graced. The silver lay hidden for 1,200 years, waiting to tell its partial story to people who could appreciate its artistry, but never fully understand its meaning. A day in Pictish Burghead. Dawn comes early to Burghead in summer, the sun rising over the North Sea to paint the fortress walls gold and pink. The settlement awakens gradually, smoke beginning to rise from household fires as women kindle flames from carefully preserved embers. The fortress stands on a promontory that juts into the Moray Firth like a fist, defended on three sides by cliffs and sea, on the fourth by massive ramparts of stone and timber. Within these defences, nearly 30 acres contain a community of perhaps 1,000 souls, making this one of the largest fortified settlements in northern Europe. You smell breakfast cooking, barley porridge bubbling in iron cauldrons, fresh bread baking in clay ovens built into the sides of houses, fish caught before dawn by boats that launch from the beach below the cliffs, roasts over open fires. Children emerge from roundhouses, their voices mixing with the cries of gulls and the constant sound of waves against rock. Men check weapons and tools, preparing for another day of the endless work that maintains a fortress this size. Some will repair sections of rampart damaged by winter storms. Others will work in the workshops that cluster near the eastern gate, where smiths forge everything from ploughshares to sword blades, where carvers create the decorated stones that proclaim Burghead's importance. The great hall dominates the highest point of the promontory, its timber walls decorated with painted shields and carved beams that tell stories of royal genealogy, going back to heroes who fought Romans. Inside, King Bride holds court, receiving envoys from other Pictish kingdoms, settling disputes between nobles, planning the eternal balance of war and diplomacy that keeps Fortrew dominant. His warriors train in the courtyard outside, their swordwork watched by young boys who dream of joining their ranks. The clash of iron on iron rings across the fortress, punctuated by shouted instructions in the Pictish language that will be dead in 3 centuries. At the sacred well, priests perform morning rituals that blend Christian prayer with older observances. They lower a bucket into the darkness, drawing up water that tastes of stone and depth, water that has never seen sunlight, water that carries properties beyond simple refreshment. Petitioners come throughout the day seeking healing, blessing, prophecy. The priests interpret signs in the water's surface, in the echo of voices from the well's depths, in the behaviour of ravens that nest in the chamber's upper reaches. This is a place where the old gods and the new Christ coexist, not easily but necessarily, as the Picts negotiate their changing spiritual landscape. As afternoon fades toward evening, the fortress takes on a different character. Warriors return from patrol, reporting all quiet on the borders. Fishing boats beach below the cliffs, their catches hauled up steep paths to feed the evening meal. In the great hall, a bard begins the evening's entertainment, his voice carrying stories that are already ancient, tales of heroes and monsters, of kingdoms won and lost, of the time before time when the stones themselves were young. Outside, guards take their positions on the ramparts, watching the darkening sea for Viking sails that will, in coming centuries, bring doom to this mighty fortress. The coming of Columba. The year 563 AD brought to Pictland a man whose influence would transform their culture forever. Columba, exiled from Ireland for his role in a bloody dispute over a copied manuscript, arrived on Iona with 12 companions and a mission to convert the heathen. But the Picts weren't simple pagans waiting for enlightenment. They had their own sophisticated religious traditions, their own understanding of the sacred, their own reasons for eventually accepting this new faith that had already conquered much of the former Roman Empire. King Bride, Mac Maelshon, ruled Fortrew from his fortress near modern Inverness, and it was to him that Columba travelled, understanding that converting the king meant converting the kingdom. The journey from Iona through the Great Glen took Columba through the heart of Pictish territory, past standing stones carved with symbols that predated Christ by centuries, through landscapes where every hill and stream had its own deity or spirit. His biographer Adam Nunn, writing a century later, describes miracles performed along the way. But between the lines, we can read a different story. Careful diplomacy, respect for local customs, and the political acumen to recognise that Christianity's success required accommodation with existing power structures. The meeting between Columba and Bride was theatre as much as theology. Bride's druids, and yes, the Picts had druids, though we know almost nothing about them beyond their existence, opposed the Christian mission. They performed their own miracles, engaged in magical contests that Adomnan describes with the excitement of a sports commentator, but Columba had advantages beyond any spiritual power. He brought literacy in a form the Picts could use, not Latin, but the vernacular writing that would let them record their own laws and histories. He brought connections to the wider Christian world, to Ireland and beyond, trade and diplomatic networks that could benefit an ambitious king. Most importantly, he brought a theological framework that didn't require abandoning Pictish culture, but could absorb and transform it. The conversion wasn't instant or complete. Bride allowed Columba to preach, but didn't immediately convert himself. It took years of patient work, of monastery building, of demonstrating that Christianity could coexist with Pictish kingship. The key breakthrough came when Columba showed that Christian blessing could legitimize royal power just as effectively as Druid approval, that the new god could be a god of warriors as well as monks. When Bride finally accepted baptism, he did so as a king who saw political advantage as clearly as spiritual benefit. His symbol stones continued to be carved, but now they incorporated crosses alongside the ancient symbols. His warriors still painted themselves for battle, but now they also wore Christian amulets. The sacred wells became holy wells, the seasonal festivals became saints' days, and Pictish culture began its long transformation into something new while desperately trying to remain itself. Echoes in the Highland wind. Listen to the wind moving through the great glen on a winter evening, and you hear voices that have spoken here for 2,000 years. It begins as whisper through pine needles, builds to a moan around standing stones, becomes a howl that carries across lochs, whose surfaces ripple with memories of ancient boats. The Picts heard this same wind, interpreted its moods, recognized its warnings. They built their fortresses in places where the wind brought news from miles away, where you could hear approaching armies in the change of its tone, smell weather changes days before they arrived. In the fortress ruins that crown seemingly every Scottish hill, the wind plays architect, showing you where walls once stood by the way it channels through gaps in stone. At Craig Fadrig, Bride's stronghold, you can stand where Pictish sentries once stood and feel the same winds that brought them intelligence of Columba's approach. The wind carries the cry of golden eagles that nest in the same cliff faces where Pictish boys once climbed to prove their courage. It brings the sound of red deer calling in autumn rut, the same sound that would have told Pictish hunters where to find their prey. But there are other echoes here too, human voices preserved in place names that even Gaelic speakers struggle to pronounce correctly. Pit names, from the Pictish word for a piece of land, scatter across eastern Scotland like fossil memories. Pitodree, Pitlochry, Pittenweem, each one a fragment of Pictish speech frozen in the landscape. When locals pronounce these names with the particular accent of their region, they're speaking words that Pictish mothers used to call their children home, that Pictish kings proclaimed in their halls, that Pictish priests intoned in ceremonies will never understand. The wind remembers even when human memory fails. The Aberlemno stones. 2 miles from the traditional site of the Battle of Dun-Nectine stands a churchyard where the Picts carved their victory in stone with such detail that you can still read the story 12 centuries later. The Aberlemno sculptured stones, particularly the magnificent churchyard cross slab, preserve in sandstone what no written chronicle could capture. And so, the visual memory of how the Picts saw their greatest military triumph. This isn't mere decoration, but historical documentation in symbolic language, propaganda, and memorial, combined in ways that would have been instantly readable to any Pict who passed. On one side, a Christian cross dominates, surrounded by the abstract interlace and key patterns that Celtic Christianity made famous. But turn the stone around, and you enter a different world. At the top, Pictish symbols float mysteriously, their meaning locked away but their importance clear from their prominent position. Below them, the battle unfolds in carved scenes so vivid you can almost hear the clash of weapons. Warriors on horseback charge with spears levelled. A Pictish fighter, identifiable by his symbols, strikes down an enemy whose helmet marks him as Northumbrian. At the bottom, the most telling scene, a warrior flees on horseback while birds, probably ravens, pursue him. This is Ecgfrith's army in retreat, harried by the carrion birds that Pictish warriors saw as battlefield spirits. What makes this stone remarkable isn't just its historical content, but its artistic sophistication. The carver understood perspective, showing overlapping figures to create depth. He understood narrative flow, arranging scenes to be read in sequence like a modern comic strip. He understood symbolism, using size to indicate importance, positioning to show victory and defeat, details of weaponry and armour to distinguish friend from foe. This was an artist trained in traditions that went back centuries, working in a style distinctly Pictish, while showing awareness of artistic developments across Europe. The horses prance with a life that transcends stone, their manes flowing, their muscles taut with motion frozen mid-stride. Standing before this stone as sunset light angles across its carved surface, you understand that the Picts weren't just warriors but chroniclers of their own glory. They chose to record their history not in words that could be miscopied or mistranslated, but in stone that would outlast any parchment. Every person who passed this stone for generations would have known exactly what it commemorated, would have felt pride in their ancestors' victory, would have understood that they belonged to a people who could defeat the strongest kingdom in Britain. Today, we can only partially read their message, but the emotion comes through clearly. Triumph, pride, and the determination to be remembered. Masters of the northern seas. The Picts were not a landlocked people cowering in highland fortresses, but maritime masters who controlled the seas around northern Scotland with fleets that could project power from Orkney to the Isle of Man. Their boats, evolved from ancient Celtic designs but adapted to the rough waters of the North Atlantic, appear on symbol stones and in archaeological remains that show sophisticated understanding of naval architecture. At Port Mahomac, on the Tarbat Peninsula, archaeologists discovered evidence of a Pictish naval base and monastery combined, where boats were built and maintained, using techniques that wouldn't look out of place in Viking shipyards 2 centuries later. Picture these vessels cutting through the grey waters of the Moray Firth, their leather sails taut with North Sea wind, their crews singing in that lost language as they row through calm passages between islands. They weren't the dragon ships that would later terrorise these same waters, but smaller, more manoeuvrable craft, perfect for the complex coastline of northern Scotland with its countless sea locks and hidden harbours. The boats on the symbol stones show high prows and sterns, multiple oars, and what might be fighting platforms or cargo areas. Some stones depict what appear to be naval battles, with boats ramming each other while warriors fight with spears and slings. The Picts' naval power explains mysteries that puzzled historians for generations. How did they maintain control over territories separated by mountains but connected by sea? How did Orkney and Shetland, 70 miles from mainland Scotland, remain Pictish when Vikings could have taken them easily? How did Pictish artistic styles and symbol stones appear in the Western Isles, traditionally considered purely Gaelic territory? The answer lies in those boats carved on symbol stones, in the harbours archaeologists are only now discovering, in the understanding that the Picts saw the sea not as barrier but as highway. Their kingdoms were maritime entities, controlling coastlines and islands rather than continuous land territories. Trade goods found in Pictish sites confirm their naval reach. Mediterranean pottery, Frankish glassware, Irish metalwork, and even Byzantine coins all arrived via sea routes the Picts controlled or accessed. They exported too, though we're less certain what beyond slaves, which were the dark currency of early medieval Europe. The distribution of Pictish symbol stones along coastlines and navigable rivers shows a culture oriented toward the sea, placing their monuments where they could be seen from water, marking safe harbours and territorial boundaries for those who approached by boat. When the Vikings finally arrived in force, they found not easy victims, but experienced maritime opponents who knew every current, every hidden rock, every defensive advantage their complex coastline offered. You walk the halls of power. You are a visiting Irish noble, come to the court of King Nectan at Forth-Clyde in 710 AD, and everything about this place surprises you. You expected barbarian squalor, perhaps impressive in a primitive way, but essentially crude. Instead, you walk through a hall whose timber beams are carved with interlacing patterns so complex that your eyes struggle to follow single lines from beginning to end. Painted shields hang on the walls, each one telling through its symbols the lineage of the warrior who bears it. Light enters through windows of translucent horn, casting amber illumination that makes everything seem touched by honey. The king sits not on some rough throne, but on a chair of carved oak, decorated with silver plates, each plate inscribed with those mysterious symbols you've seen on standing stones throughout your journey. He wears a cloak of wool so finely woven it seems to flow like water, dyed in the deep blue that only Pictish craftsmen seem able to achieve, fastened with a silver brooch that would not disgrace an emperor. Around his neck hangs a chain of silver links, each one decorated with different symbols. The whole thing, a statement of power that needs no translation. His warriors stand behind him, their bodies painted despite it being peacetime, the patterns indicating their ranks and achievements in a code you cannot read but whose importance you clearly understand. The hall fills with petition seekers and courtiers, and you're struck by the presence of women not as servants but as participants. A woman who must be noble by her dress, and bearing speaks directly to the king about a land dispute, citing precedents in that lilting language you cannot understand. Though your interpreter whispers translations, the king listens carefully, asks questions, consults with advisors of both genders. This is not the patriarchal absolutism you know from home, but something more complex. Power flowing through channels you don't fully comprehend. When judgment is given, a scribe records it not in Latin letters, but in those linear ogham scratches that preserve Pictish law in Pictish language. Evening brings entertainment, but not the simple heroic lays you expected. A bard performs, yes, but his art is more complex than any you've heard. He doesn't just recite but acts out his stories, his voice becoming different characters, his painted face changing expression to match his narrative. Behind him, musicians play on instruments familiar and strange, harps you recognize, drums you know, but also curved horns that produce sounds like wounded animals, and something that might be a flute, but sounds like wind through stone. The music and story interweave, creating an experience that transcends simple entertainment to become something almost ritualistic. You understand now why the Romans never conquered these people. How do you defeat a culture this sophisticated, this confident, this completely itself? The art of war. Pictish warriors entered battle as walking artworks, their bodies painted in patterns that served purposes far beyond mere intimidation. The designs followed rules as strict as any military uniform, indicating rank, achievement, clan affiliation, and spiritual protection. Before major battles, the painting ritual could take hours, with specialized artists applying woad and other pigments in patterns passed down through generations. Each warrior became a living symbol stone, carrying the power of his ancestry and his gods into combat. The psychological effect on enemies who faced these painted warriors was devastating, especially on those encountering them for the first time. But beneath the paint lay practical military expertise. Pictish armies weren't howling mobs, but disciplined forces that understood complex battlefield tactics. They perfected the schiltron, a defensive formation of spearmen that would later become the signature Scottish military technique. Packed tightly together, with long spears projecting like a hedgehog's spines, these formations could stop cavalry charges cold. At Dun-Nectan, it was probably schiltrons that trapped and destroyed Ecgfrith's mounted nobility. The Picts also mastered terrain warfare, using Scotland's complex landscape as a weapon. They knew every glen that could hide an ambush, every ford where enemies could be trapped, every hillside that gave advantage to defenders. Their weapons evolved from Celtic traditions, but showed distinctive Pictish characteristics. The leaf-bladed spears depicted on symbol stones appear repeatedly in archaeological finds, perfect for both thrusting and slashing. Their swords were pattern-welded, a technique that created flexible, yet strong blades with distinctive water-like patterns in the steel. They used small, round shields, more maneuverable than Roman rectangular ones, decorated with symbols that probably carried spiritual significance. Some warriors, particularly nobles, wore mail shirts of exceptional quality, the tiny iron rings so well made that examples still survive in museum collections. Flexible as cloth, despite 12 centuries of corrosion, the Picts understood that warfare was as much about intelligence as combat. Their scouts ranged far beyond their borders, often disguised as traders or pilgrims. They maintained beacon systems on hilltops, able to transmit messages across the kingdom faster than any rider. They practiced deception, allowing enemies to see weakness where strength waited, leading invaders into carefully prepared killing grounds. When they fought to win decisively, understanding that in their world of small populations and limited resources, a Pyrrhic victory was the same as defeat. This combination of artistic intimidation, practical tactics, quality weapons, and strategic intelligence made them formidable opponents who maintained their independence against every enemy until internal politics succeeded where external invasion had failed. When the Vikings came, the first Norse sails appeared in Pictish waters, like harbingers of apocalypse, square-rigged and blood-red against northern skies. The year was 794 AD, when the monastery at Iona first burned, though Pictish coastal settlements had probably seen raiders earlier. Unrecorded strikes that left only archaeological evidence of sudden violence. These weren't the trading visits the Picts had known for generations, Norse merchants who came to barter Baltic amber for Pictish goods. These were something new and terrible. Warriors who fought without fear of death, who saw monastery wealth as plunder rather than sacrilege, who brought a savagery that even the war-hardened Picts struggled to comprehend. Picture the horror of a Pictish fishing village, seeing those distinctive ships approaching. The Vikings had perfected a form of warfare the Picts couldn't counter with traditional methods. They struck from the sea without warning, their shallow draft vessels able to navigate rivers and locks that Pictish defenders thought impassable. They fought with a berserk fury that overwhelmed disciplined formations, each warrior seeking glorious death as eagerly as victory. Most terrifyingly, they kept coming. Kill a Viking raiding party, and another would arrive next summer, drawn by tales of wealth and weak defences. The Picts had faced invasions before, but always from kingdoms with limits, with other borders to defend, with reasons to eventually make peace. The Vikings seemed infinite, pouring from Scandinavia in waves that grew stronger each year. The archaeological record shows how Pictish society changed under this pressure. Settlements moved inland from vulnerable coasts. The great promontory fortresses like Berghead, perfect for controlling sea trade, became death traps. When the sea brought enemies who fought without rules, the Picts understood. New fortifications appeared on inland hills, designed not to control territory, but simply to survive. The exquisite metalwork that characterized Pictish culture begins to disappear from the archaeological record. either hidden in hoards that were never recovered, or simplified as craftsmen fled or died. Symbol stones from this period show changes too, their designs becoming simpler, their messages perhaps more urgent, though we cannot read the desperation that might be carved there. By 800 AD, the Vikings weren't just raiding but settling. Orkney and Shetland, Pictish territories for centuries, fell under Norse control so completely that the Pictish language disappeared entirely from these islands, replaced by Old Norse dialects. The Hebrides became contested ground where Pictish, Scottish, and Norse cultures collided and merged in ways that created new identities. The pressure pushed Pictish kingdoms into alliances they would never have considered before. Forth-Clyde, the great northern kingdom that had dominated Pictish politics for centuries, found itself fighting for survival. The southern Pictish kingdoms, pressed between Vikings from the sea and Scots from the west, began to look for new solutions to old problems. The stage was set for transformation or extinction. The prophecy of Scone. High on the Moot Hill at Scone, where the River Tay winds through some of Scotland's most fertile land, stood a stone that embodied the mystery of Pictish kingship. Not the famous Stone of Destiny that would later crown Scottish and English monarchs, but an older stone, a Pictish symbol stone that marked this place as sacred long before anyone thought to unite Picts and Scots. Legend spoke of a prophecy connected to this stone, words spoken in the tongue that was already becoming extinct, promising that whoever held Scone held Scotland, that the kingdom would unite under one who could read the symbols, understand both traditions, bridge the gap between painted warrior and Celtic prince. The prophecy, if it existed outside of later invention, might have been political theatre, carefully crafted words designed to ease a transition already underway. By 840 AD, Pictish and Scottish royal lines had intermarried for generations. Kings ruled both peoples, sometimes simultaneously, their legitimacy recognised differently by each group, but functionally creating shared sovereignty. The sacred site at Scone sat perfectly between Pictish and Scottish power centres, accessible to both, claimed by neither exclusively. Here, where ancient Pictish stones watched over proceedings, where Scottish nobles could see their western homeland's mountains on clear days, a new kingdom could be proclaimed that was neither purely Pictish nor purely Scottish, but something unprecedented. The ritual importance of Scone transcended any single tradition. Pictish kings had been proclaimed here, possibly using that matrilineal succession system that so puzzled later chroniclers. Scottish kings brought their own ceremonial traditions, including perhaps that famous Stone of Destiny, with its supposed connection to biblical Jacob. Christian ceremonies overlay pagan ones, with abbots blessing what druids once consecrated. The place itself held power, one of those locations where geography and history combine to create inevitable significance. Rivers meet here, trade routes converge. The land itself announces its importance through fertility and strategic position. Any prophecy about Scone's role in Scotland's future was less supernatural prediction than geographic inevitability. Kenneth MacAlpin's Gambit. Kenneth MacAlpin, known to history as the first King of Scots, was probably neither purely Scottish nor purely Pictish, but something more complex, a man who understood both worlds well enough to unite them through methods that remain controversial 12 centuries later. In 843 AD, he became king at Scone in a ceremony that marked the beginning of the Kingdom of Alba, what would become Scotland. But how he achieved this transformation remains one of history's great mysteries, with theories ranging from peaceful succession to genocidal conquest. The traditional story, written centuries later by Scottish chroniclers with their own agendas, claims Kenneth invited Pictish nobles to a feast at Scone, where he had them murdered, their bodies tumbling through trapdoors into pits below the hall. It's a dramatic tale that explains the sudden disappearance of Pictish identity, but it's almost certainly false. The logistics alone make it impossible. You cannot murder the entire nobility of 7 kingdoms in one night and expect to rule anything but chaos afterward. More likely, Kenneth represented a fusion already generations in the making. His claim to kingship, recognised through Pictish matrilineal succession and Scottish patrilineal traditions simultaneously. Consider the political reality of 843 AD. Viking pressure had devastated both Pictish and Scottish territories. The kingdom of Forth-Clyde had fallen to Norse raiders. Its great fortress at Burghead burned and abandoned. The southern Pictish kingdoms faced constant threats from Northumbrian ambitions, despite the victory at Dhu Nectine over a century earlier. The Scots, centred in Argyll, couldn't expand west into the sea or south into Forth-Clyde. Union offered both peoples what they desperately needed: combined military force, unified response to external threats, and access to resources neither could secure alone. Kenneth didn't conquer the Picts so much as offer them a transformation that preserved what mattered most: survival, while sacrificing what had become impossible to maintain: distinct political identity. The genius of Kenneth's approach lay in his preservation of Pictish administrative structures while imposing Scottish royal ideology. He kept Scone as his capital, maintaining its sacred significance. He preserved Pictish laws and customs where they didn't conflict with Scottish traditions. Most importantly, he seems to have maintained the loyalty of Pictish warriors and nobles, who continue to appear in chronicles for generations. After 843, gradually adopting Scottish names and customs, but clearly representing continuity rather than replacement, the Pictish symbol stones continue to be carved for at least another century, though now they incorporated Scottish and Christian elements more prominently. Kenneth created not a Scottish kingdom that conquered the Picts, but an Alban kingdom that merged both traditions into something new. The last Pictish king. History doesn't record his name with certainty, this last man to rule as a purely Pictish king, though chronicles suggest several candidates. Perhaps it was Druss, son of Ferrat, who ruled briefly before Kenneth's ascension, or Bruda, son of Ferrat, who might have been the same person under a different name. The confusion itself tells the story. By the mid-800s, Pictish and Scottish identities had become so intertwined that even contemporary chroniclers couldn't clearly distinguish between them. The last Pictish king wasn't dramatically defeated or murdered, but simply absorbed into a new reality where the distinction no longer mattered. Imagine this unnamed king's final years, watching his world transform beyond recognition. The language his ancestors had spoken for millennia was dying, replaced by Gaelic in daily conversation and Latin in religious contexts. Young nobles preferred Scottish names to Pictish ones, seeing greater prestige in association with the new order. The symbol stones that had proclaimed Pictish identity for centuries still stood, but fewer craftsmen knew how to carve them, and fewer still understood their full meaning. In his own court, this king probably needed translators to communicate with younger courtiers who'd never learned the ancient tongue properly. He was becoming a relic in his own lifetime, a living connection to a world that everyone could see was ending. Yet perhaps this last king understood something we've forgotten, that cultural death doesn't always mean defeat. The Picts weren't eradicated, but transformed, their bloodlines continuing in Scottish nobility, their symbols incorporated into Scottish heraldry, their sacred sites becoming Scottish power centres. The last Pictish king might have chosen this transformation deliberately, recognising that rigid adherence to distinct Pictish identity meant extinction under Viking pressure, while fusion with the Scots meant survival in altered form. His decision, if it was a decision rather than helpless acceptance of inevitable change, preserved Pictish genetic and cultural heritage within the new Scottish matrix. Every modern Scot, with ancestry in eastern and northern Scotland, carries Pictish blood, inherits Pictish stubbornness, lives in landscapes the Picts named and sanctified. The end came not with battles, but with silence. One day, the last person who could read the symbol stones in their original meaning died. The last speaker, of the Pictish language, breathed their final words in a tongue no one else understood. The last warrior to paint his body in the ancient patterns passed without teaching the designs to his sons. The last Pictish king became simply a Scottish noble, his Pictish identity a genealogical curiosity rather than lived reality. The painted people vanished not through conquest, but through transformations so complete that their disappearance only became apparent in hindsight, like realizing a familiar friend has been gone for years without your noticing the exact moment they left. You stand at the threshold. You are Malchon, born in 920 AD, to a Pictish mother and Scottish father, standing in the ancient fortress of Dunatar as morning mist rises from the North Sea. Your grandmother still speaks the old tongue when she thinks no one is listening, whispered words that sound like wind through stones. Your father serves King Constantine, calling himself Scottish, though his own grandfather painted his face for battle. You carry both heritages in your bones, feel both traditions pulling at your identity like tide and shore. Neither winning, both essential. The fortress around you shows this same duality. Ancient Pictish stonework forms the foundations, those carefully fitted blocks that need no mortar, supporting newer Scottish timber halls where different songs echo. In the chapel, a Pictish symbol stone serves as altar, its crescents and beasts watching over Christian Mass. Nobody quite comfortable with the arrangement, but nobody willing to change it either. The priest reads Latin, the nobles speak Gaelic, but sometimes in the workshops you hear craftsmen use words that belong to neither language, technical terms for metalworking and stone carving that survive because no other words quite capture their meaning. You watch your own son playing with other children and realize he will never know the confusion you feel. To him, there's no contradiction between the Scottish prayers his mother teaches and the Pictish patterns his great-grandmother draws in the dirt when she tells her stories. He is simply Alban, belonging to this new kingdom that encompasses both traditions without fully understanding either. When he sees the symbol stones that dot the landscape, he doesn't see mysterious messages from a lost people but familiar markers of home, as natural as mountains and rivers. The transformation is complete in him, achieved not through violence or conscious decision, but through the simple passage of time, as the sun burns through the mist, revealing the vast expanse of sea and land that stretches before you. You understand that you stand at history's threshold. Behind lies the Pictish past, those painted warriors who held Rome at bay, who carved their triumphs in stone, who knew the secret names of every Highland stream. Ahead lies the Scottish future, kingdoms and wars and transformations you cannot imagine. You exist in the narrow space between, perhaps the last generation to remember what was lost, the first to glimpse what might be gained. Your choice? To embrace the new while honouring the old, or to cling to fragments of a shattered past, will determine whether Pictish memory survives or vanishes entirely. What the stones remember. Modern technology has begun to unlock secrets the Picts thought they'd hidden forever. Laser scanning reveals carvings worn too faint for human eyes to detect, showing that many plain stones once bore elaborate symbols. Ground-penetrating radar exposes foundations of structures around symbol stones, proving they stood not in isolation, but as parts of complex ceremonial or administrative centres. Chemical analysis of stone surfaces finds traces of pigments, confirming that these monuments once blazed with colours we can now only imagine: red ochre, yellow orpiment, green malachite, white lime, and always that distinctive Pictish blue from woad. At Rhynie, in Aberdeenshire, archaeologists have uncovered what might be the oldest Pictish power centre ever found, dating from the 4th to 6th centuries AD. Here, symbol stones stand where they were originally erected, not moved by later farmers or Victorian collectors, but remaining in their original sacred landscape. The excavations reveal a complex of massive timber buildings, larger than anything previously known from Pictish sites, suggesting centralised authority earlier than historians believe possible. Metal detecting finds include pieces of Germanic glass and Mediterranean pottery, proving that even in their earliest centuries, the Picts were connected to European trade networks. The stones at Rhynie bear some of the most archaic symbols known, possibly representing the system in its original form, before centuries of evolution and elaboration. New interpretations challenge old assumptions about what these stones meant. Digital analysis reveals mathematical relationships between symbol combinations that suggest a writing system more complex than simple pictograms. The consistency of symbol grammar across hundreds of miles and centuries of time indicates centralized control over meaning, possibly schools where stone carvers learn not just technique, but also the symbolic language itself. Some researchers now believe the symbols might represent not just names, but concepts, legal proclamations, territorial claims, astronomical observations, or religious dedications. The mirrors and combs, rather than being feminine symbols, might represent reflection and ordering, philosophical concepts rather than physical objects. Most intriguingly, comparison between Pictish symbols and other ancient writing systems reveals unexpected connections. Some symbols bear striking resemblance to Bronze Age rock art from across Atlantic Europe, suggesting continuities of meaning that stretch back thousands of years before the Picts. Others seem to parallel Ogham letter combinations in ways that hint at bilingual inscriptions we don't yet know how to read. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle, while revealing how much larger the complete picture must be. The stones remember more than we imagined, holding information about mathematics, astronomy, law, theology, and history, all encoded in symbols that remain beautiful, even when incomprehensible. Names upon the land. Drive through eastern Scotland, and you drive through a ghost language. Place names that preserve Pictish words like insects in amber. Every settlement beginning with Pit was once Pictish. Pitlochry, Pittodrie, Pittenweem, Pitcapel, Pitfitchy, hundreds of them scattered across the landscape, like breadcrumbs leading back to a vanished world. The word meant a portion or share of land in Pictish, and its survival in Scottish place names tells us something important about the transition from Pictish to Scottish rule. These weren't renamed places, but continued ones, maintaining their Pictish identities even as the people who lived there forgot what the names meant. Aberdeen, that granite city on the North Sea, preserves in its name the Pictish word Aber, meaning river mouth, combined with the River Don, whose own name might be pre-Pictish, reaching back to the earliest Indo-European speakers in Scotland. Perth possibly comes from a Pictish word for wood or copse. Atholl means new island in Gaelic, but might incorporate an older Pictish element. Even Edinburgh, Scotland's capital, might contain Pictish roots, though centuries of folk etymology have obscured the original meaning. These names create a linguistic map of Pictish territory, showing us where they lived, how they thought about landscape, what features they considered important enough to name. Water features especially preserve ancient names. Rivers hold their names longer than any other landscape features, because changing them disrupts too many connections. The Don, the Dee, the Tay, the Ness, all might be Pictish or even older, their meanings lost, but their sounds preserved by generations who knew these waters by no other names. Loch Ness, home to its famous monster, bears a name that meant something specific to the Picts who lived along its shores, who built their fortress at Urquhart, where they could watch the whole length of that narrow water. When we say these names, we speak words that Pictish mothers used to warn children away from dangerous waters, that Pictish poets incorporated into songs we'll never hear, that Pictish kings proclaimed in edicts we'll never understand. The survival of these names wasn't accidental, but represents conscious decisions by Scottish administrators to maintain continuity. Changing place names confuses tax collection, disrupts legal proceedings, and angers local populations unnecessarily. So the names persisted, even as their meanings faded, becoming sounds without semantic content, familiar mouth music that connects modern Scots to ancestors they might not even know they have. Every time someone says Pitlochry or Aberdeen, they perform a small act of resurrection, bringing dead language briefly back to life, even if only as an echo of meaning that once was clear as Highland air. The mystery of the symbol stones deepens. In 2017, archaeologists at the University of Aberdeen announced a discovery that revolutionized Pictish studies. Mathematical analysis of symbol combinations revealed patterns consistent with a written language, not mere decoration or heraldry. The symbols follow grammatical rules, appearing in predictable sequences that suggest syntax rather than random combination. If correct, this makes Pictish symbols one of the few independently developed writing systems in medieval Europe, created by people supposedly barbarian, according to Roman and later medieval standards. The research shows that certain symbols always appear at the beginning of inscriptions, others always at the end, with predictable variations in between. This positional grammar resembles how languages structure sentences, with subjects, verbs, and objects in regular relationships. Some symbols appear to modify others, perhaps indicating plurals, tenses, or cases. The mirror and comb combination might function as a determinative, signaling that the surrounding symbols refer to a specific category of person or concept. The various beast symbols might represent names or titles, but names and titles that follow linguistic rather than purely pictographic logic. Yet we still cannot read them. Without a Pictish Rosetta Stone, without bilingual inscriptions that provide the key, the symbols remain locked. We can see that they carry meaning, even identify the structure of that meaning, but not access the meaning itself. It's like hearing a conversation in an unknown language. You can identify questions by their intonation, recognize proper names by their repetition, understand emotional content by tone, but the actual message remains opaque. The Picts achieved something remarkable, creating a writing system sophisticated enough to record complex information, consistent enough to be used across vast territories and long time periods, yet unique enough that when the last readers died, they took comprehension with them permanently. Modern efforts to decode the symbols using artificial intelligence and pattern recognition software continue, but they face a fundamental problem. Successful decipherment usually requires either bilingual text or known names and words to provide starting points. The Picts left us neither. Their symbols stand alone, beautiful and mute, testament to a literary tradition that flourished for centuries before vanishing without explanation. Each new analytical technique reveals more about how the system worked structurally, while the meaning remains as distant as ever. The stones speak, but in a language that exists now only as patterns, without words, grammar without vocabulary, messages that will remain forever sent, but never again received. Twilight over ancient stones. Evening comes gently to the Pictish stones at Aberlemno, that soft Scottish twilight that seems to last forever in summer. The light turns golden, then amber, then the deep purple of heather-covered hills. The carved symbols catch this changing light differently with each passing minute, spirals seeming to rotate, beasts appearing to move, the whole surface of the stones becoming animate in the dying day. Sheep graze around the monuments, their bells creating a music that hasn't changed since Pictish herders watched their flocks in these same fields. The stones cast lengthening shadows across grass that grows from soil enriched by 16 centuries of human presence. Every generation that lived here left its trace. Fragments of pottery, lost coins, organic materials that decomposed into the earth. The stones stand at the centre of these accumulated memories, monuments not just to specific Pictish individuals, but to continuity itself. Wars passed over this landscape, Vikings raided, Scots and English armies marched and countermarched, but the stones remained, too large to move, too impressive to destroy, too mysterious to fully ignore. As darkness finally comes, the stones become silhouettes against a sky where the first stars appear. These are the same constellations the Picts watched, though they called them by names we'll never know, saw different heroes and beasts in their patterns. The moon rises, a crescent, like those carved on so many Pictish stones. And you wonder if that symbol meant simply moon or something more complex. Time, femininity, cycles, power, transformation. In this twilight moment, with the modern world held at bay by gathering darkness, the distance between now and then shrinks. The stones remember what we've forgotten, holding in their carved surfaces the thoughts and beliefs of people who saw this same landscape, felt this same evening breeze, watched this same moon rise over Scotland countless times before fading into history's shadows. Legacy in stone and story. The Picts left no written chronicles, no epic poems, no genealogies beyond cryptic king lists preserved by Irish monks. Yet their legacy permeates Scotland like water through rock, invisible but essential, shaping everything it touches. Modern, Scottish identity, that particular combination of fierce independence and cultural sophistication, owes as much to Pictish ancestors as to Celtic ones. The Scottish reputation for resilience, for refusing to be conquered or absorbed, began with those painted warriors who faced down Rome and won through endurance rather than military victory. In Scotland's legal traditions, traces of Pictish law survive. The emphasis on communal land ownership rather than pure feudalism, the recognition of women's property rights unusual in medieval Europe, the importance of symbolic objects in legitimising authority, all might echo Pictish precedents. Scottish Gaelic itself, though linguistically Celtic, contains numerous words of unknown origin that might be Pictish borrowings, terms for landscape features, animals, and technologies specific to Scotland. The Scottish clan system, with its emphasis on symbolic identity through tartans and badges, might represent a transformation of Pictish symbol traditions into forms comprehensible to medieval minds. Architecturally, the Picts pioneered techniques that became quintessentially Scottish. The brocks they inherited and perfected influenced later Scottish tower houses. Their skill in dry stone construction, building without mortar, became a Highland tradition that continues today. Most remarkably, their symbol stones established a tradition of monument carving that evolved into the elaborate Celtic crosses, and eventually the Gothic stonework that adorns Scottish churches and castles. When you see intricate carved thistles on Edinburgh buildings or Celtic interlace on Highland gravestones, you're seeing artistic traditions that began with Pictish craftsmen carefully pecking symbols into standing stones. The deepest legacy lies in the Scottish relationship with landscape itself. The Picts saw their land as sacred, every hill and stream having meaning beyond the physical. This spiritual geography survived Christianization, survived modernization, that remains embedded in Scottish consciousness. The Scots' famous attachment to their land, that emotional connection that survives emigration across oceans and generations, might begin with Pictish ancestors who carved their belonging into stone, who painted their bodies with the patterns of their homeland, who chose transformation over abandonment when their world changed beyond recognition. Every Scottish sunrise over Highland mountains, every mist-wrapped glen, every standing stone, whether carved or plain, carries forward Pictish memory even when we no longer remember what we're remembering. The Picts in modern memory. Today, the Picts have become Scotland's mystery, claimed and reimagined by each generation to serve contemporary needs. Victorian antiquarians saw them as noble savages, proof that Scotland possessed ancient traditions independent of English influence. Modern Scottish nationalists invoke them as the first defenders of Scottish independence, conveniently forgetting that Scotland as a political entity didn't exist until the Picts themselves helped create it. New Age seekers see in Pictish symbols evidence of lost wisdom, astronomical knowledge, or spiritual insights that modernity has forgotten. Gaming and fantasy writers populate their fictional worlds with painted warriors inspired by Roman descriptions of Pictish fighters. Museums across Scotland display Pictish treasures with the reverence usually reserved for crown jewels. The symbol stones have become pilgrimage sites for tourists seeking authentic Scotland beyond Edinburgh Castle and Loch Ness. Local communities take pride in their Pictish heritage, maintaining and protecting stones that their ancestors might have seen as obsolete reminders of a superseded past. The National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh devotes entire galleries to Pictish artefacts, using the latest technology to help visitors understand a culture that left no texts to explain itself. Virtual reality reconstructions let you walk through Pictish fortresses. Augmented reality apps overlay symbol stones with speculative translations. DNA analysis lets modern Scots discover their Pictish ancestry percentages. Yet for all our technology and scholarship, the Picts remain fundamentally unknowable, and perhaps that's their greatest gift to Scotland and the world. In an age where everything seems explained, catalogued, and understood, the Picts remind us that mystery survives. Their symbol stones stand as monuments to the limits of knowledge, beautiful puzzles that prove the past held civilizations as complex and sophisticated as our own, yet utterly different in ways we cannot recover. They teach humility to archaeologists who would explain everything through pottery shards and post holes. They offer inspiration to artists who see in those swirling symbols permission to create meaning without words. They provide identity to Scots who understand that their heritage includes not just the documented clans and kingdoms, but also these painted people who refuse to be fully known. Final reflection: the people who became Scotland. The painted people never truly vanished. They transformed, adapted, and merged into something new, while leaving their essence embedded in Scotland's bones. When you walk Highland Hills where Pictish warriors once stood watching for Roman legions, when you trace with wandering fingers the symbols carved on standing stones, when you speak place names that preserve words from a dead language, you participate in their continuity. The Picts achieved a peculiar kind of immortality, not through conquest or literature, but through transformations so complete that Scotland cannot be imagined without them. Their story reminds us that cultural death and cultural transformation are not the same thing. The Picts ceased to exist as a distinct people, their language silenced, their traditions absorbed, their very name becoming a historical curiosity. Yet every aspect of their culture that mattered, their artistic vision, their political structures, their spiritual connection to landscape, their unconquerable spirit, survived by adapting to new circumstances. They chose relevance over purity, survival over stubborn adherence to forms that no longer functioned. In doing so, they ensured that while we might never again hear Pictish spoken or see warriors painted for battle, we would continue to live in the world they shaped. The mystery of the symbol stones becomes less frustrating when understood this way. Perhaps we cannot read them precisely because their message was never meant for us. But for other Picts, communications within a cultural context so specific that removing that context removes meaning. The stones succeed in their deeper purpose, making us wonder, forcing us to acknowledge complexity in peoples we might otherwise dismiss as primitive, creating beauty that transcends comprehension. Every scholar who struggles to decode them, every tourist who photographs them, every child who asks what they mean, performs an act of remembrance for people whose names we'll never know but whose presence we can never escape. As Scotland moves forward into futures the Picts could never have imagined, their legacy travels along, quiet but persistent, in Scottish stubbornness that refuses domination, in Scottish creativity that produces distinctive art from unlikely materials, in Scottish connection to land that transcends ownership to become identity. The painted people persist. They are the ghost in Scotland's machine, the ancient code running beneath modern programs, the painted patterns that show through Whenever Scottish culture asserts its distinctiveness, the Picts discovered that the only way to become truly immortal was to disappear so completely into their successors that forgetting them becomes impossible. They painted themselves into Scotland's DNA and ensured that as long as Scotland exists, something of the Picts endures. The stones stand still in Scottish fields, as they have for over 1,000 years. Their symbols keeping secrets we'll never unlock, their presence marking places where history pivots on forgotten hinges. The Picts who carved them painted their bodies with similar designs, understood something we've lost about the relationship between human meaning and natural landscape. They knew how to belong to a place so completely that leaving marks upon it became unnecessary because they were themselves the marks, walking symbols of their land's identity. When they vanished into Scottish identity, they took their language with them but left their essence behind, painted into the Scottish consciousness with indelible cultural woad. We began this journey with Romans, encountering warriors whose painted bodies defied Mediterranean comprehension. We end it with modern Scots carrying Pictish blood and traditions without always knowing it, living in landscapes named in a tongue they'll never speak, inheriting stubbornness and artistry from ancestors whose names dissolved into historical silence. The transformation from Pict to Scot wasn't defeat, but metamorphosis, a people choosing to survive by becoming something new while preserving everything that mattered. Their symbol stones remain unread, but not meaningless. Their language remains unspoken, but not entirely lost. Their culture remains invisible, but not absent. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, picture those Pictish warriors one more time, their bodies covered in spiraling blue designs that meant things we'll never understand. See them not as barbarians resisting civilization, but as people who chose their own path to complexity, who created art that still takes our breath away, who faced down the world's greatest empire and won by refusing to play by its rules. Remember that they looked at the same stars, you see, felt the same Scottish rain and wind, loved the same landscapes that define Scotland today. They painted themselves with the patterns of their belonging, and when the time came to choose between preservation and transformation, they chose to become the foundation upon which Scotland would build its future. I'm grateful you've accompanied me through these historical landscapes tonight. May ancient peace settle over you like a gentle blanket,